Yep. Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be invited to talk about some of the work that I've done over the last 2 years at Aarhus in Denmark, looking at sort of megafauna restoration and how sort of these conceptual ideas about trophic rewilding can be used for conservation management. And what I'll do today is I'm just going to give a bit of a wide overview of some of the work that I've done. So if you have any sort of questions about the finer details, please do sort of ask some questions or get in touch with me later, because I guess there's lots to talk about, and it's best just to give a bit of an overview of everything. So with me, but first, I've worked a lot in Australia, looking at trophic cascades, looking at how things like dingoes and bettongs influence other species and vegetation across. And then, yes, I did a ecology, and particularly how wildfire influences. The last 2 years have been spent in Denmark, in a town called Aarhus, and this is a picture of Aarhus, very classic postcard Europe, with buildings that actually do look like this. And one of the interesting things about Denmark is that there's hardly any ecology. Most of it is actually land, and has been for a very long time. It looks like in Denmark most of the time, and you do spend a lot of time riding in the rain. So I guess you might ask, why would an Australian ecologist interested in sort of biodiversity and these kind of things want to work in Denmark? Well, I was lucky enough to work with Professor Jens Christian Svenning in the Biochains Research Group, who do work all over the world looking at how megafauna, large-bodied species, influence to work on a project in South Africa, and particularly in the area in the northeast of South Africa around Kruger National Park, looking at how large-bodied mega herbivores, and in particular elephants, influence these beautiful savannas. So I guess the crux of why we were interested in looking at megafauna relates to this graph, which is similar to many graphs groups since 1500. And as we can all see, there's an increase. One of the things that's quite interesting and sobering in many regards is we're still getting lots and lots of species going extinct now, comparable to what was happening 100 or 200 years ago in some instances. And yeah, and one of the things that was always interesting to me about these kind of graphs is that, yeah, there are many species still going extinct, and this suggests that perhaps we need to be considering other and perhaps novel conservation initiatives that may be able to bend these species extinction curves. Framework for this, and in simple terms, trophic rewilding advocates the reintroduction of. The idea is you once had this very important species that was there, it went extinct. Landscape, you can install the trophic cascades that it once facilitated, and in doing so, you can restore ecosystems. Rewilding, as shown in this graph here, is that most of the studies published in rewilding have really been focused on essays or opinion pieces, as shown in the left column, with experimental studies or non-experimental empirical studies being relatively rare historically. And this is changing, and this is something that my work really focused on doing, trying to sort of test some of these ideas of trophic rewilding and seeing how relevant they might actually be for conservation management. And one thing that I'll also really focusing on this idea of Holocene rewilding, that is, we've got a historical baseline of years that we're trying to. So there has been lots of work done on trophic rewilding, but most of this work has been really focused on essays and opinion pieces, with relatively few studies looking at experiments and non-experimental. One thing that I'll note is that I'll really be focusing on this idea of Holocene rewilding, which suggests that we have So the historical baseline that I'll be sort of talking about is more this Holocene rewilding, which is things that have gone extinct, you know, last couple of hundred years following sort of industrialization and colonial.
So elephants are actually a really interesting species because they once widespread across Sub-Saharan Africa, as shown in the map here of Africa. They were once present across all of this green area, but due to overhunting largely in the 17 and 1800s, they are now restricted to smaller areas as shown in those little red areas. Another thing about elephants is that they're very, very strong ecosystem engineers. So they have been shown to have the capacity to reduce woody vegetation cover and density very strongly. And this is through herbivory, because they're mixed feeders, including a lot of browse in their diet, and because they have this tendency of liking to push down trees and break tree branches. And this is particularly relevant for this idea of trophic rewilding, because in the absence of elephants from many areas, we've had this thing called bush encroachment, or what we call shrub encroachment in Australia. So over the last 100 years, in many areas of Africa, we've had very strong increases in woody vegetation cover and density. And it has been suggested that elephants may be an interesting biological vector to reduce woody vegetation densities in these areas where they were once common, but have been absent for a couple of hundred years. And one of the things that I'm actually quite interested in, because of my work in trophic cascades before, is trying to see if we can see or identify an indirect effect of elephants and their impacts on vegetation, which acts as fauna habitat, on the use of this habitat by different fauna species. So the area I conducted my study was in South Africa and northeast South African savannah, to be specific. In this map, in the bottom right of South Africa, we can see in the top right-hand corner, there's a big boot, a big shoe, which is in dark green, and this is Kruger National Park. So I worked in Kruger National Park and in some of the reserves adjoining Kruger National Park. And this landscape is actually really interesting because we have all these different little nature reserves close to each other, where elephants have been reintroduced at different times. Now, I've come from a couple of years doing research on wildfire, and in Australia, we really, over the last 50 or 60 years, have focused on this idea of time since fire as being a very important determinant of sort of vegetation succession and vegetation processes. So I kind of took this same approach to my research, and I really wanted to primarily focus on this idea of time since elephant reintroduction. How does time since elephant reintroduction influence different ecological responses? Are all responses responding similarly? Are some responses responding differently? And these types of questions. So what I did for about 6 weeks, took a lot longer than I expected, as it always does when you're doing these kind of space for time substitute studies, is I tried to select a number of sites that were within the same sort of biophysical and climatic settings, and therefore allowed me to focus on my research question of interest. And this, yeah, like I said, took quite a long time, and we did quite a lot of sort of preliminary analyses to justify that indeed all these sites that we selected were actually comparable for many and very different things. So we ended up having 5 different reserves and 52 sites across these 5 different reserves. Now, the 5 different reserves included a reserve that was a control, where elephants were absent, and then 4 reserves with different elephant reintroduction times. And these times were between 2003 and 1927. So as you can sort of guess, what we're looking at here is the longer term implications of elephant reintroductions, rather than sort of those instantaneous effects on the vegetation. And this is particularly important for, I guess, vegetation, because if you think about how vegetation often responds to these kind of biological disturbances, you would expect that a lot of these effects would take a long time to become apparent So our assessments across reserves of reintroduction times of 16 to 92 years provided a unique opportunity to maybe infer some processes occurring at these longer temporal scales. So these are some of the sites where we conducted our research. So within these savanna landscapes, we've got this grassy understory, which is continuous, and then we've got an overstory of woody vegetation, which can be very thick in some spots and very sparse in other spots. And these landscapes are actually dominated by a wet, dry sort of subtropical landscape. And in the dry season, everything drops its leaves, all the grass senesce, waiting for the rains to come again. So initially we wanted to sort of see, does rewilding influence vegetation, that is fauna habitat, and really trying to see if the trajectory of post-rewilding impacts different ecological responses differently. Now we went into the field and did field surveys at all our sites, assessing 17 ecological responses. And most of these responses were associated with these three things. Firstly, landscape openness, which is things like woody plant and tree densities, the impacts on these different tree and shrub species, and also sort of things like the size of their canopies and some of the other sort of morphological attributes of the trees themselves. We also looked at other things like groundwood, which is just pushed over trees or broken branches, and tree hollows. And this was because these two things particularly strongly impact fauna by creating habitat or influencing sort of landscapes of fear. So we had some predictions about how elephant reintroduction time would influence these 17 ecological responses. It's not really that important what these predictions are. All these predictions are at the moment. It's just suffice to say that we suggested that a landscape openness, that is the inverse of woody vegetation density and cover, would be highest where elephants have been for a long time, as opposed to elephants where elephants have been for a shorter amount of times, and would be landscape openness would actually be lowest in areas where elephants are absent. That is, the highest woody vegetation densities and cover will occur in areas where elephants are absent. Now, these are some of the responses, and I'm not really going to go in detail to describe all of these different graphs because they all have their own unique stories. But what we're showing here is on the y-axis, this is the density or the abundance of one of the ecological responses we measured. The top row is things associated with trees, the middle row is different sized tree hollows, and the bottom row is different sized coarsewood debris or groundwood items. And on the x-axis, we're seeing the 4 different reserves of different elephant reintroduction times, with older reintroduction times on the left and younger reintroduction times on the right. And what we're actually showing in these graphs is the difference between each reserve where an elephant is present and the control reserve. So without going into any details, what we can see is there are some positive associations with reintroduction time, some negative associations with reintroduction time, and some non-responses to reintroduction time. And these things can be broadly grouped as per what I said. So we've got things that increase with elephant reintroduction time. So these are things like woody plant damage and actually the density of large sized tree hollows. So that is, we have an increase in landscape openness as we get elephants being in the landscape for longer. That is, we get a decrease in woody plant density and also the density of these groundwood items. And this groundwood effect is largely because where you have elephants, they like pushing down trees, and where elephants have only been for a short amount of time, there are more trees to push down. We have some responses that are not impacted by elephant reintroductions at all. This is a common woody plant species called the red bush willow. It didn't respond to elephant reintroduction or elephant reintroduction time at all. And then we had some responses that always were positively or negatively affected by elephant reintroduction, irrespective of elephant reintroduction time. And a good example of this is a tree called a marula tree, which is a very common tree species. And marula trees were always more common where elephants were absent than present and were unaffected by elephant reintroduction time at all. This suggests that the effects that elephants might have on marula trees may actually become apparent at younger reintroduction times before that we could assess here. And one of the things that I'll just highlight is that overall, the strongest effect we observed was that elephants' reintroduction time primarily influences landscape openness. That is, where you've got elephants for a short amount of time, you've got a denser vegetation, a more closed savanna landscape, And as you have an increasing elephant reintroduction time in, that is, elephants have been there for a longer amount of time, this dense vegetation gets reduced, the landscapes get more opened, and you get this more of a heterogeneous landscape that is dominated by an open woody vegetation component that is typified by these small islands of dense woody vegetation within it. So I guess the next step that we wanted to do was say, well, does elephant rewilding actually, does this effect on the vegetation translate to impact the animals themselves, so the site use? And we focused on mammals because mammals are a well-studied group. So there's lots of information on them, and it's actually quite easy to assess mammals with these landscapes using things like camera traps. So we really wanted to sort of test some hypotheses surrounding sort of landscape openness, and in this case we're using shrub density as a proxy for landscape openness. And we would, I guess, given the literature, we would suggest that where you've got sort of more open landscapes, that is areas where you've got higher shrub, where you've got more open landscapes, and lower shrub densities, you would expect to have a dominance of larger species, and within the herbivores, larger grazers. And this is because the grass provides the food for these grazers, and the grass would be more common where you've got a lower woody vegetation because there's less competition. But also these larger species are preyed on by larger predators such as lions and leopards and wild dog. And these species often rely on sort of concealment within vegetation to be able to actually catch these prey. So larger species like zebra here actually rely on open environments to be able to detect predators before they have a chance to catch them. On the other side, where you've got higher shrub densities, we would predict that perhaps you might have more smaller species. And this is because smaller species tend to be able to hide themselves more easily in these densely vegetated patches. You might think of these species as being the hiders. And so therefore, because they can conceal themselves more easily, maybe they actually benefited by more closed savannas where you've got higher shrub densities. Also, browsers perhaps would be benefited in these landscapes too. And that's because the browsers actually rely on the woody vegetation themselves as food. So we went about answering sort of this question by three approaches. So firstly, we did a qualitative trait-based analysis looking at, for the mammal species present within our study sites, which of these mammal species preferred closed savannas where elephants have been, which are typified by areas where elephants are absent or have only been in the landscape for a relatively short amount of time, as opposed to open savannas, which is associated with areas where elephants have been for a prolonged amount of time. And this, I guess, is the right side of this top row with the circles and the lines. And what we showed was that using just this is very broad brush approach, where we went through a whole bunch of field guides and noted down which species preferred open or closed savannas. On the left, we see the species that preferred the closed savannas, and these species are really typified by smaller species, typified by herbivores, which are browsers or mixed feeders, and by omnivorous species. So we've got a dominance of things like mongoose and rodents, things like jackals, and these smaller browsers like steenbok or nyala. On the right side of this graph here, in this middle row, we can see that where we've got areas which are dominated by open savanna, and this corresponds to areas with an older elephant reintroduction time, we've got species in this group which are dominated by larger species in body mass generally, species that are herbivores that are grazers, and carnivores which prefer to prey on these larger prey types. So I guess this suggests that yes, elephant reintroductions and elephant reintroduction time may indirectly influence the mammal communities within these landscapes. However, we use this sort of fairly sort of broad brush approach to be able to get at this answer. So we thought maybe we could do this a little bit better. So what we did is we went and we put camera traps at 18 sites for a 6-week period, and we assessed the site use of the different herbivores within these landscapes, and we focused on herbivores because they were more common. And then we wanted to see if there was an association between the site use of different herbivore species relative to differences in shrub density within the site surrounding the cameras. And these are some of the results of this study. So what these graphs are showing are shrub density on the x-axis and the probability of observing one of these 4 different mammal species on the y-axis. So we've got scrub hares on the left, steenbok, impala, and zebra. And as you can see in the bottom row there, the body size of these species varies between 4.5 kilos and 340 kilos, and that there's a diversity of different grazers, browsers, and mixed feeders. And what we can generally see, without going into these graphs too much, is that the 2 smaller species, the scrub hare and the steenbok, are showing similar responses with a use of densely vegetated areas during the daytime, particularly. And on the other side, the larger species, and particularly the impala, tend to be showing a negative association with shrub density. That is, their activity is greatest, or the probability of observing these species is greatest in areas where there are low shrub densities. One other thing to note is that within the larger species and the smaller species, we've got both a grazer and a browser or a mixed feeder, and we can see that there are slightly different responses between these 2 life history strategies as well. So I guess collectively, this kind of lends support for what we showed previously in this graph, that perhaps smaller species are preferring sort of areas, closed savanna landscapes, which are typified by higher shrub densities, whereas these larger species are preferring more open landscapes. And perhaps this relates back to food availability and anti-predator defense strategies. And we can also see that there are these differences between grazers and browsers or mixed feeders as well. Interestingly, we have another species in this system, which is the giraffe, which was very common, and the giraffe actually didn't respond to shrub density at all. It just went wherever it wanted to, and this accords with other research suggesting that although giraffes do get preyed on by things like lions, the population density of giraffes within the study area is probably not influenced by predation at all. And then we conducted an additional study. We thought, well, let's go to even smaller. What about smaller species? How are small species using these open and closed landscapes? We would predict that a small species like a rodent, and this rodent species here is the Natal's multi-mammate mouse, would perhaps prefer to use sort of more closed environments where they can get away from predators, as opposed to more open landscapes. So we conducted a paired study where we put trail cameras in an open area, which is shown in the right picture, and within a tree that's been pushed over by an elephant, which is the image in the middle. And then we compared the site use and some measures of behaviour between these 2 areas that were replicated across 10 different experimental sites. And what we showed was that the site visitation on the left and the incidence of feeding behaviours and resting behaviours were higher in the coarse-wooded debris, or this fallen down tree patch, as opposed to the open patch. So this provides further evidence that these smaller species are preferring to occur in these more closed rather than open landscapes. So I guess sort of in conclusion, the work that I did in South Africa has really showed that elephants are these really have strong ecological effects on the vegetation, which acts as the homes and the food for many and very different fauna species. And by influencing the vegetation and the fauna habitat, they differently impact different species of different sizes and with different life history strategies. And I guess this is all happening along these longer temporal scales. And that's kind of, I guess, the most important thing about a lot of the research that we did. You know, as an environmental manager, this might be really important information for you if you want to enact some sort of trophic rewilding strategy using an approach like this, not only for elephants, but for any species in general. We can predict what landscapes might be like at any point post reintroduction, and then we can manage the landscape accordingly if you so wish to. And coming back to this idea of trophic rewilding, by providing evidence that trophic rewilding actually can influence ecosystems and in doing so sort of promote biodiversity, we can try to curb some of these species losses that we've been seeing in contemporary environments across the world. And I guess where to from here with trophic rewilding, what we were talking about when I was having my technical issues. We've been talking about Holocene rewilding in my talk, and this is actually happening in a lot of places in Australia with reintroduction of things like Tasmanian devils and bettongs, and I guess the conservation of dingoes in some areas. But perhaps we can also think about trophic rewilding and this idea of Pleistocene rewilding, not only in other parts of the world, but also in Australia. And this idea suggests that ecosystems co-evolved with species over hundreds of thousands or millions of years. At the end of the Pleistocene, which was about 60 to 15,000 years ago in Australia, a whole guild of mega herbivores and carnivores went extinct. And the extinction of these species was just a blip in the timeline when you think about evolution. So perhaps by reinstalling some of the functional roles of these now extinct species, we may be able to promote biodiversity or shift our ecosystems towards a state that is associated with a historical baseline that's further back. And if we think about what's present in Australia at the moment, we have actually a lot of these functional equivalents present. So perhaps we might want to consider, at least conceptually, that perhaps some of these species might act as functional analogues to what was present before, but with a very strong caveat that we know that a lot of these species have very, very different ecological roles in some instances to what was there before. They might all be similar browsers or whatever, but we know that they have different wallowing behaviours or different hoof structures that actually have very strong negative effects. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that perhaps we don't advocate using invasive species for Pleistocene rewilding, but if you do want to go down that path, perhaps we need to weigh up the benefits versus the risks. And that's actually what has been done by this great paper by Chris Johnson and David Bowman, looking at trophic rewilding as a mechanism to control fire across large areas. And one of the case studies they use is this swamp buffalo in Northern Australia. So again, thank you for dealing with all the technical issues that I had. And yeah, if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer them.